Was John Candy as nice as the warm-hearted characters he often played? Many of the beloved actor's co-stars had some surprising answers to that question. John Candy was born in the Toronto area in 1950 and subsequently raised there by parents Evangeline and Sidney Candy, the latter who worked as a car salesman. When John was just 4 years old, his father died unexpectedly from a heart attack. Sidney Candy was 35 years old. The devastating loss impacted the family financially, too. Following her husband's death, Evangeline and the children moved to the Toronto borough of East York and into a shared home with the boys' grandparents and an aunt.
She was very young at the time, to lose a husband at that time, and to have two young boys. Very courageous.
Into adulthood, John remained haunted by his father's death, especially after he developed similar medical issues and unhealthy addictions. As a child, Candy loved going to the cinema, but his real dream was to become a professional athlete. He played offensive tackle for his Toronto area high school football team in the late 1960s until he seriously injured his knee. With his sports dreams over, Candy focused on performing and came of age right when Toronto was in the midst of a live comedy boom. But he never lost his passion for football. Candy's career starring in blockbuster comedy movies of the 1980s made him wealthy enough that he could buy a stake of a franchise in the Canadian Football League. In 1991, he and hockey legend Wayne Gretzky purchased a 10% share of Candy's hometown CFL team, the Toronto Argonauts. At the end of his first season as a team owner, the Argonauts captured the CFL's championship, the Grey Cup. The first iteration of Second City opened in Chicago in 1959 as a small theater to showcase improvisational and sketch comedy. It evolved into an acting and comedy factory, providing the training ground for hundreds of famous and notable performers, including John Candy. Second City Toronto hired Candy in 1973 when he was 22 years old. 3 years later, when producer Andrew Alexander developed a television adaptation for Canada's Global Network, Candy was among the first of the theatrical comedians hired. Initially titled the Second City Television Network, SCTV boasted some generational talent, home to future comedy superstars like Catherine O'Hara, Eugene Levy, Rick Moranis, Harold Ramis, Martin Short, and Candy. It aired on and off throughout the late 1970s, mostly in Canada. Candy left the show in 1979 to pursue a movie career. He would later return to SCTV, but not until after a series of near misses with another legendary sketch comedy show. After 5 seasons, all of the remaining original cast members of Saturday Night Live left the show in 1980, along with creator Lorne Michaels. The quality of the show suffered as a result, and NBC couldn't secure advertisers for the series, so they started looking for alternatives, including Roadshow. First proposed as a series to air in the SNL time slots when that show took breaks, Roadshow eventually joined the list of possible permanent replacements. A comic travel log, it featured Candy roaming America interviewing real people. At least 2 episodes apparently aired in 1980, but the show ultimately wasn't ordered to series. Then, when Dick Ebersol took over as SNL head producer in 1981, he attempted to poach SCTV stars and convince them to join SNL instead. Candy was his prime target. But at the same time, NBC executive Irv Wilson was working to bring SCTV to American television. It sparked a feud between the two execs, leading reporters to pester Candy for comment. Being in the middle of the scandal upset Candy to the point where he retreated to his farm in Ontario and didn't answer his phone. Ultimately, SCTV began airing on NBC as a part of its late-night lineup in 1981. Candy rejoined the series instead of SNL, becoming one of SCTV's main stars for the next 3 seasons.
Well, I show them. I show them all.
While all the SNL drama was playing out, Candy kept busy appearing in projects on both sides of the border. 1976 had been his big breakout year as he appeared in 3 other Canadian TV shows that year in addition to SCTV. But in 1981, Candy exploded as an international star. Not only did SCTV begin airing in America, but Candy also starred in CBC's Tales of the Klondike and had a star-making role in the hit American film Stripes alongside fellow SCTV veteran Harold Ramis.
I'm gonna walk out of here a lean, mean fighting machine.
And even as he became a bigger and bigger movie star, he still stayed in touch with his Canadian roots. In 1983, Candy made a pivotal cameo in National Lampoon's Vacation, but he also starred in the Canadian film Going Berserk with fellow SCTV stars Joe Flaherty and Eugene Levy. And 2 years later, Candy entertained American audiences in Summer Rental and Brewster's Millions, while also appearing in the CBC mockumentary The Canadian Conspiracy. The 1983 comedy classic National Lampoon's Vacation finds a Griswold family suffering one disaster and indignity after another. When they finally reach their destination of the theme park, Wally World, they're thwarted by a self-important doofus of a security guard who prevents them from entering, at least temporarily.
I'm afraid I'm gonna need a little more than that, sir.
Okie dokie. How's this?
The movie ends with the Griswolds riding all the rides, with Candy held as a hostage until the park's owner Roy Wally shows up with the authorities. But originally it had a very different ending, one without Candy. In the original version, the Griswolds skipped the park and harassed park founder Roy Wally at his home. But test audiences hated it, so director Harold Ramis asked screenwriter John Hughes to come up with a better ending. Ramis cast John Candy as a security guard in the hastily filmed new scenes. Candy quickly came up with a character by reviving a goofy security guard he'd played on the 1970s Canadian kids series Coming Up Rosie. Ramis said, "We edited it, we attached it to the film, we tested it, and then the test marketing went through the roof at that point. The rethink kind of saved the picture in a big way." Del, the obnoxious, big-hearted traveling salesman in 1987's Thanksgiving road comedy Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, is arguably Candy's most iconic role. Written and directed by frequent Candy collaborator John Hughes and co-starring his friend Steve Martin, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles offered an environment that made the actor comfortable to offer suggestions about the film's creative direction. For instance, a scene in which Martin has a hallucinatory vision of Candy's character as the devil was one of Candy's ideas. It was also an idea that studio execs didn't necessarily love. Candy's son Chris told The Hollywood Reporter, "They were really over budget and over schedule, and Paramount was coming down to get everything going. Well, that was the day they were filming the scene with the devil costume. My dad had the idea that it would be funny if Steve Martin saw Del as the devil. So the Paramount execs finally get on set, and Dad is walking around in this devil costume, and they're like, what the hell does this have to do with anything?" John Candy appeared in some of the most definitive comedy films of the 1980s and early 1990s, including Stripes, Spaceballs, and Home Alone. But there were a number of movies he almost appeared in which remain as big what-ifs. For instance, the 1980 comedy Used Cars was meant to star Candy as Sam Slayton. But after rehearsals, he dropped out because his agent had landed him a role in another movie that took precedence, so he ceded the part to his SCTV co-star Joe Flaherty. Following Candy's acclaimed performance in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Monty Python alum Graham Chapman approached him to star in Ditto, playing a guy who uses a photocopy machine to clone himself. But Chapman died in 1989 with the film unmade. For the animated Pocahontas, Candy recorded dialogue for a wisecracking animal sidekick named Redfeather. Filmmakers entirely cut the character out of the movie. And then there's Ghostbusters. Director Ivan Reitman offered Candy the role of Louis Tully, the Keymaster. But Candy had his own ideas about the character. Reitman said, well, maybe if I played him as a German guy who had a bunch of German Shepherd dogs. The filmmaker passed on making the changes, Candy passed on the parts, and his fellow SCTV star Rick Moranis got the gig instead. Candy was one of the biggest celebrities around, but according to his co-stars, he was also one of the nicest. While filming Spaceballs, Candy asked Mel Brooks to change the script and to give some of his funny lines to Bill Pullman in what was a young actor's biggest role to date.
Check, please.
And in 1991, while filming Only the Lonely with Hollywood legend Maureen O'Hara, Candy discovered that they had given him a bigger trailer, so he swapped with her. And it wasn't just big stars that he was kind to. In the early 1980s, future comedy writer and late-night host Conan O'Brien arranged for Candy to visit his college, Harvard University, and gave himself the job of showing Candy campus. O'Brien said that when he told Candy he was thinking about trying comedy, Candy gave him some vital career advice, saying, "Kid, you don't try comedy, you do it because you have to." And I walked away from that thinking, he's right.
And it was magical because he taught me a lesson. He was everything I wanted John Candy to be in person.
Candy's involvement with SNL was limited. He hosted an episode in 1983 and made a cameo in an SNL special in 1985. But he could and probably should have been on a lot more. Former SNL writer Bob Odenkirk explained in James Miller's Live from New York that Lorne Michaels would have a short list of potential hosts that he could choose from, with the rejected option being burned in the show's terminology. Odenkirk said, 2 weeks ahead of time, they've got a pool of names, 2 or 3 people, and they asked these people to host the show. Supposedly, John Candy was like the most burned potential host in that he would never host the show because he'd been asked to do it so many times and then told no thanks at the last minute. Still, despite this and the failure of Roadshow, Candy gave NBC another try in 1992. With producing partner Jason Shub, the actor pitched a special called Bram Stoker's John Candy Special. With the title mocking the then-current film Bram Stoker's Dracula, Candy's concept involved him playing himself hosting a show that was broadcast from the moon. However, it was never made, at least in part because Candy and Shub weren't aware that their development deal with NBC had already expired. While known for his prodigious output of comedic films and television work, John Candy harbored the ambition to try serious acting. In the early 1990s, he played against type in the romantic dramedy Only the Lonely, and portrayed attorney Dean Andrews Jr. in Oliver Stone's historical piece JFK. During pre-production of Telling Lies in America, Candy invited screenwriter Joe Esterhaus to his home and literally begged for the lead role. Esterhaus wrote, "He said he was trying to change his image from the goofball funny man to a real actor. Within weeks, though, Candy's agent forced him to quit because of an old grievance against Esterhaus, and it wasn't the only near miss. Candy also nearly played the main character in a film version of the tragic real-life story of Fatty Arbuckle, a silent movie star turned accused murderer, and blowhard Ignatius J. Riley in an adaptation of the award-winning novel A Confederacy of Dunces. Unfortunately, though, Candy passed away just when he was seemingly on the verge of a breakthrough into more dramatic fare. One of Candy's final projects was Hostage for a Day, a kidnapping comedy in which he starred and directed. He filmed it in various sites around his home province of Ontario, but the final film in which Candy would participate was a Western comedy called Wagons East. Released in August 1994, the critically panned box office bomb stars Candy as a wagon master who guides unhappy Old West settlers in their return to the East Coast. On March 3, 1994, Candy filmed his last scene for the movie on location in Mexico. After speaking briefly with his children in Los Angeles over the phone, Candy prepared an after-midnight dinner of spaghetti for his team of assistants. Then he called his co-stars Richard Lewis and Robert Ricardo to praise their work on Wagons East and went to bed. Candy didn't wake up in the morning. Sometime in the night, the actor suffered a heart attack and died. He was just 43 years old.